Welcome to the Brute Facts Podcast with your host and everybody's favorite Christian, Eddie Kroom. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell for future content.
Welcome to Brute Facts. Man, how do you like that that opening right there? That was from a friend of mine, Pasta Mike at Pasta Mike Productions. He does awesome work. Absolutely love it. And he loves me so much that he decided to do a bunch of them for me. So anyway, I have a fantastic guest today, Joe Schmid. He is an author. He has peer-reviewed papers, I believe, that's been submitted. Maybe, I don't know, I'll let him talk about it. I know he's helped out on some things. Anyone that's in philosophy of religion definitely knows who Joe is. So without me talking too much and bringing on the star of the show, let's get ready. How are you doing, Joe?
I'm doing wonderful. I'm so excited for this.
Absolutely. So we've kind of been in, like some of the other guys that I've brought on here, we've been in philosophy group together. I think we've interacted a couple of times, but I've been a fan of your work for a while. You're a young guy, but most definitely talented. And you like to hang out with one of my favorite atheists, Graham Oppie. So you also run a YouTube channel. What's your YouTube channel?
It's Majesty of Reason. It comes from a quote from Baruch Spinoza, and the quote, it's like my favorite quote. It is, what altar of refuge can a man find for himself when he commits treason against the majesty of reason? So
absolutely. You got to love Spinoza.
Yeah.
Spinoza's fantastic. So most people, if they have seen Joe work or do his videos or any of his work or stuff, you probably don't even know if he's a theist or not. Because I know that for a while, I didn't know if Joe was a theist or not. So I think that's a badge of honor, though, because you come at it pretty objectively and understand both sides of it. So where do you stand on that?
Yeah, so roughly, the best characterization is probably like agnostic. That's probably the best characterization. Now, there are different ways you can break down what it means to be an agnostic. So I break it down quickly into three different categories. So one of them is just a kind of suspension agnostic, where you just completely suspend your confidence level. Like, you don't say that your confidence level is 0% that God exists, or 100% or 50%. You just suspend it entirely. Another one is an epistemic agnostic. So that's what I would fall into. And that is essentially saying either that, hey, I do have a confidence level in the proposition that God exists. Maybe it's around 50%, roughly, something like that. That's one way that you could do it. Or another way you could say, like, it's kind of indeterminate or ambiguous where the evidence points after all the weighing up and whatnot. And so it's not like you're suspending it entirely, but you still kind of are, remaining agnostic. So that's the second one, epistemic agnostic. And then the final one is a kind of in-principle agnostic, where they say you cannot know in principle either way whether or not God exists. Like maybe God would be so transcendent that our minds, our finite and limited minds, cannot even grasp, or something like that. Who knows?
Yeah.
So yeah, I would fall into the epistemic agnostic. I'm not sure if I would say, I used to say about 50-50 either way, but I'm coming to appreciate perhaps a more kind of, I don't know, it's a little bit more indeterminate. I think there might be some aspects of incommensurability in my evidence base. So
if you were leaning somewhere, it'd probably be deistic, maybe, or.
Oh, well, it would be just agnostic. I mean,
I'm with you.
Between theism and naturalism, which I take to be the two most plausible kind of worldviews on offer. By theism, I just mean the kind of perfect being theism, where God's a necessarily existent perfect being. He's kind of the foundation of reality. Versus a kind of naturalism, where the only things that exist are, or the only concrete things that exist at least are, natural concrete things and natural causal powers that they have. Now, it's hard to define what we mean by natural, but it could be something like spatiotemporal, perhaps, or perhaps something like physical or grounded in the physical. So that would allow for mental properties and whatnot, just as long as they are ultimately explained by physical properties. That's how Paul Draper defines it. But anyway, those are the two main ones that the two main theories that I kind of like to compare, and I'm kind of agnostic on that right now.
Okay, yeah, I get that. It's a pretty honest position. I'm one of those that I don't say that I have. I'm a Christian, but I don't have certainty. I kind of lean towards like a Trent Doherty type of my beliefs and confidence should be proportionate to each other. So. Which is kind of ironic because I started out as a Reformed epistemologist.
Oh, wow.
And so I was a huge fan of Plantinga. So I just didn't like the, it seemed like a get out of jail free card, for a lot of people who don't do their epistemic duty to, be justified or have confidence in their belief. So,
yeah, I mean, personally, I do kind of fall in line with the more Doherty, Swinburne, Draper kind of approach. But I reckon because my specialty really isn't in epistemology, so I can't really pick any fights with people who are epistemologists who would be on the more Reformed side or whatever. I'll just stay out of those fights. I'll be like, okay.
Well, and that's another thing is it carries the weight, being Reformed epistemology when it's really not even. It doesn't have to do with Reformed theology. So when you say Reformed epistemology, immediately people are thinking presup and all of this.
Yeah.
So it carries that, that kind of negative connotation with it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they should find another, maybe just call it like some kind of externalist, like externalist Christian friendly or something like that. I don't know.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. I'm just an externalist. And I think that if there's an inner witness of the Holy Spirit, we can be warranted. There we go. We're done. So, so tell us about your journey. How did were you raised as a theist, Christian, or anything, or how did all that work?
Yeah, so I was raised Christian, definitely, and very devout. I know some people say devout. I don't know. I'm from the Midwest, so I just say like devout. I was from a very devout home, and I remember praying and everything. And I went to Christian private school. K through 12, actually, K through 12th grade. So I've had theology classes basically like every day. And around, let's say, okay, so I've always been really interested in debating stuff. And I remember getting my first like iPod Touch or something in like 4th or 5th grade. I think it was like 4th grade. And I immediately got Instagram and I would like go on there and have like actual like pretty deep discussions on things that were interesting to me, like abortion and other stuff at that time. Yeah. And I would like actually like debate like random people on the internet. And I found that super fun. I just really enjoyed debating, and not like this kind of tribalistic, but actually, focusing on the issues and whatnot. So that's go on.
I'm sorry. Yeah, that's kind of what happened with me, except I'm a lot older than you. So when we had AOL, and dial up, and I know back in the
telegraph,
telegraph. No, I had found myself into a chat room, and it was full of Muslims, and I didn't realize that it was a Muslim chat room, and that kind of started the journey of talking to other people and debating, thinking I knew everything, and of course I didn't know anything.
Yeah.
But, exactly. So, what settled you on agnosticism? Just the uncertainty of it.
That's a good question. So, like I said, 4th, 5th grade, I got this iPod Touch, and I'm really starting to get into questions about abortion, and then that eventually, I don't know, it led me to really like science and philosophy and these kind of bigger questions and whatnot. And so in 7th or 8th grade, we started learning about evolution, and I was just captivated. I was fascinated by it. I remember like looking at my hand, and I was like, "Oh, this is the product of like hundreds of millions of years of natural selection." I thought it was so beautiful. And of course, I was like a theistic evolutionist. So I thought, this is clearly God-guided. I remember reading the BioLogos website and institute and whatnot, watching their videos and everything. Reading a book by, I think, Francis Collins. I think he was the former leader of the NIH or something, maybe NHS. It's called The Language of God.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
And I really enjoyed that book. And again, this is 7th, 8th-ish grade. And around 9th grade, though, I really started reflecting more on the evolutionary process, the profound suffering and languishing and agony that these non-human animals experienced for hundreds of millions of years before humans ever came onto the scene, before there was anyone, it seems, that could, develop their virtue based on such suffering or whatnot. And that kind of, and moreover, the fact that was kind of part and parcel of God's very means by which he brought about biological diversity. These kind of rocked my boat. And so I probably went into a kind of phase of atheism, probably about 9th grade, So that's freshman year of high school. And then from atheism and naturalism, it was actually a kind of robust metaphysical naturalism, because I like the work of Draper and Lauder. Lauder was popularizing it, so I definitely got into Lauder, the Secular Outpost, all that sort of stuff. And then from there, probably 11th grade, so this is sophomore year of high school, I shifted back towards agnosticism, and that was a result of the work of two people mainly, Alexander Proust and Josh Rasmussen. They both brought me to agnosticism. I started finding arguments based on the PSR and things like that for some kind of necessary foundation plausible, and so that kind of pushed me towards agnosticism. I've been there ever since. So.
Yeah, I did fantastic names. I mean, at least you were, exposed to some fantastic philosophers to begin with. By the way, I've actually sent Josh a message to get him on here. So, Josh, if you're listening, where you at, man? No, yes, I love Proust. I love Rasmussen. All of them. It's just people. Seeing Josh and and Dustin Crummett and all of these young, and even you, man, just seeing all this young talent that's involved in philosophy of religion. It's fantastic because it's a stark contrast from my background. Everybody, people that watch it pretty much know mine, so I won't go over that. But those are some great names. And I'm, to be honest with you, those are some of the things that I tell people quite often. Like, I have a bunch of atheist friends that I hang around and stuff, and they just, why do you believe? Why do you believe? And based on those same arguments that you're agnostic is the reason that even if I wasn't a Christian, I think I'd be some kind of deist or pantheist or something like that, because they just to me the arguments are just too convincing. So what coming into agnosticism, so let's see, your background was what denomination were you when you were in school?
Yeah, it was Roman Catholic.
Oh, okay. So that's not that bad then. I say that because it's the conflicts, or the the false dichotomy between science. And theology that brought me kind of through a deconstruction phase.
Absolutely.
So it was because I love science, and evolution it's so obvious. That there's some type of evolution, and seeing all these different things, and I was challenged, and the more that I dug, the more that I realized that some of those doctrines. Grew up Southern Baptist. They weren't tenable. I mean, the theology, the inerrancy, the kind of things that they held to versus reality. It just wasn't convincing to me.
That's what I got really excited when you said that, because that's what's so great about I don't know, my upbringing. Like, I'm really thankful about it because at least in general, Catholicism is very, very open to the science and the scientific method and what it's revealing to us. They're very, they were like full-blown teaching evolution in our schools. We even watched a debate between Ken Ham and Bill Nye, and this was like when it actually happened. I was in like 7th grade or something, or like 8th grade, I think, and we actually watched it, and we had to like write a paper on it, and we had to like give our own thoughts, and it was just so fun. It was so great.
You said it just. I remember the debate. Yeah, and I just Mama said, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say it at all. So.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Well, yeah, but at least in general, just the confluence of reason and faith within Catholicism, right. It's much better than you would find in lots of other, perhaps very fundamentalist, very literalist, very creationism and literalism and fundamental, all that sort of stuff like that. You just won't find that for the most part in Catholicism, and that's really good.
Absolutely, and that was one of the things, being more or less indoctrinated as a fundamentalist, is when I started reading more about Christian. First of all, I was stunned at the intellectual richness of the history of Christianity.
Yeah.
And the more that I looked at, classical theism and orthodoxy and things of that nature, and I found out that, like within the Catholic Church, they leave it open. You're allowed to have, you can believe in the literal 6-day creation. You can believe in evolution. You can believe in these different things. And I was like, what? How hard to, so, and honestly, if I need, commentary on something that I don't understand completely, a lot of times I'll go to a Catholic commentary or an Orthodox commentary because it's in most cases they take such a practical approach to it. They use common sense. They use now a lot of their dogmas I don't really get into, but so yeah, that was a cool thing. And then still trying to learn Thomas Aquinas, and all of these ancient, theologians, philosophers, things of that nature.
So, yeah, I mean, I did really just want to say also that the kind of fundamentalist, literalist upbringing, that's the perfect way, really, that you can facilitate the growth of atheism. Why? Because you have this very, very binary view of reality. It's either this strict, literalistic, infallible, 6 days, all this sort of stuff. It's this whole package versus the outside world, the atheism. And so it's like, once you see one aspect of this particular thing crumble, well then the Bible's no longer totally infallible, totally, all these other sorts of things. And then you become an atheist as a result of that. It's precisely the binary view of reality that facilitates so much deconversion, I think. Whereas if you have a more, robust view and a more, reason and faith oriented view where they're kind of integration and confluence together, you're not going to have as much of that, I think. So it's almost like they're sowing the seeds of their own demise, the fundamentalist indoctrination camp.
That's absolutely true. And a lot of these atheists that I'm friends with, and there's quite a few of them in the chat, they came from that fundamentalist background. And I tell, when I, speak with fundamentalists and we, argue a little bit over scripture, theology, and things like that, I constantly remind them, first of all, they turned me to agnosticism for a short while. But they're literally an atheist making machine because they are, they have these untenable views of the world. It's so their approach to scripture is, like you said, it's their approach to life and the world. It's like their worldview is so binary. There's no gray area. You can't have questions. You can't go out and seek for yourself or question God or things of that nature. And it absolutely destroys people. Which it is. It sent me through a spiritual crisis. Because of that. So yeah, that's an excellent point. And if I have any fundamentalists, watching, we love you. It's just, it's the whole structure, it's not specific person per se, or, that they have this nefarious agenda. So I just, I want them to know we're not going to, we didn't start the show to pick on them. So,
yeah.
So, I watched your talks with Tomaszewski on divine simplicity, which is actually a topic I've been interested in lately, and classical theism in general. And you had mentioned also that your interest is kind of in ontological modal arguments, and I'm one of those that when I first got into Anselm's, I was like, wow, that is like, that's it. That does it. That solves it, and then you hear the other side and different philosophers, you're like, well, crap, that didn't work that well. So, when you talk, I know you do a lot with classical theism, but when you talk about the modal ontological argument, is there a specific version of it that you interact with the most, or?
Yeah, so this has mainly been some stuff of like my most recent research. In addition to things on classical theism and divine simplicity and so on, which I do like research in, write papers in, and so on. I'm also getting really interested now in lots of modal ontological argument stuff. So I guess we could probably take a step back and just ask, let's break this down. Like, what do we mean by modality? What do we mean by an ontological argument? And what do we mean by God here? Before I can sort of lay out the argument. So by modality is just the study of modes, like modes of being, like ways that things are. in particular, possibility, necessity, impossibility, and contingency. And so these notions are interdefinable with one another. So take possibility and necessity. So we can say that something is possible just in case it's not necessarily false, or it's not necessarily non-existent. That just means it's possibly existent or possibly true. Moreover, it's also important to note that these kinds of modalities can apply to statements. So something can be necessarily true, like 1 + 1 = 2. Or they can also apply to beings, or like objects or things. And so, for instance, I presumably am not a necessary being or a necessary object because I could have failed to be. I could have not existed. My parents might have never met, say. So these kinds of modalities, possibility, necessity, impossibility, contingency, these apply both to statements and beings. And so, like I said, I was talking about how these are interdefinable. So, something is possible if it's not necessarily false or not necessarily non-existent, and something is necessary just in case it's not possibly false. That is to say, it's necessarily true, right? Or it's not possibly non-existent, and that just means it must exist. It cannot fail to exist. So those are the kinds of, that's really what modality concerns itself with. Now, there are 3 different kinds of possibility that we really need to disentangle if we want to.
I'm kind of a layman, so I understand. This is one of the areas that I've done a lot, so I just want to kind of break it down a little bit.
That's good. That's
easier for some of the people in the audience. So basically, in a nutshell, I'm going to oversimplify it, but when we're talking about modal logic, you have possibility, like he said, you've got possibility, you have necessity, and you have impossibility. So when we use terms like contingency and things like that, basically contingency it means it's not necessarily true or necessarily false. So when we talk about something that's necessarily true, that means it is that way and has to be that way. And possibility would be that it could be false or it could be true. So that's I hope I cleared that up for some of the people that's in the audience. But go ahead with the second part.
Yeah, no, I mean you get into the weeds really quickly. But yeah, so there are 3 before we can understand really the ontological argument, we have to distinguish between 3 different kinds of possibility, like what can be the case. So the first kind is logical possibility. So logical possibility just means consistency. It's kind of like consistency of the logical form of some proposition, say. So for instance, if I say that water is not H2O, strictly speaking, that is consistent, right? There's no like formal contradiction, merely that you can deduce from the structure of that proposition, like X is Y. There's no contradiction there, so it's logically possible. And so really, logical possibility is a matter of not entailing or involving a strict contradiction in logical form, in the structure or form or syntactical arrangement of the proposition in question. So something that would be logically impossible would be if you said something like, I both exist and don't exist. So that's something that's logically impossible because the form of that proposition, P and not P, well, that can't be true because that violates the law of non-contradiction. So that's one kind of possibility, logical possibility. It concerns consistency. Another kind of possibility, and this will become the most important for the ontological argument, is metaphysical possibility. And so it's hard to define, but roughly you can think of it as what genuinely could have been the case, what genuinely could have obtained in reality. So go back to my example of water is not H2O. That was logically possible, but that's not metaphysically possible because by its very nature, water is H2O. Water is identical with H2O. So there's no possible way that reality could be. Reality just couldn't be such that you have something that's water, but it's not H2O. Like, it just wouldn't be water. Wow. And so, again, it's difficult to define, and there are different accounts of metaphysical possibility. But you can kind of think of it as like something has to be logically possible to be metaphysically possible. So it obviously has to be consistent. But there's also, you have to like respect the natures of things as well. So like you have to respect the nature of water if you want something to be metaphysically possible. That statement about water is not H2O, that violates the very nature of water. And so that would not be metaphysically possible. So again, for the audience, metaphysical possibility, just think of it as what genuinely could have obtained in reality.
That's a good, I think that's a good simplification of it. So, and that's the thing, you know, with metaphysics, you know, if someone doesn't have, you know, an understanding of the background with metaphysics, with, you know, starting with the ancient philosophers, it's really going to be hard to convey. And it's not one of these things that, you know, you hear people say, well, if you really understand it, you could explain it well. Well, it's just not that simple when it comes to metaphysics. So, but just to be clear on this point. So, logical possibility is required, but metaphysical possibility is debatable, would be, I think, is where I would put it. When someone says that something is logically possible, you know, that's kind of, you know, true on the surface of it.
It's a low bar. It's a low bar
exactly,
for logical possibility. You just need consistency.
Yeah, so once you get there, most people don't argue with that unless you're, you know, maybe a dialetheist or something. But when you get to metaphysical possibility, that's where in philosophy a lot of people,
you have to roll up your sleeves.
Right. That's we start to kind of get dirty, you know, right there. So
right, and then there's one other form of possibility that's really important to keep in mind and to disentangle from the other ones, and that's epistemic possibility. And so that just essentially means something is epistemically possible just in case it's consistent with what you know about the actual world. So for all I know, X might be the case. That's what it means for X to be epistemically possible. So for all I know, Goldbach's conjecture, which says that, I think that's every even is the sum of two primes or something like that. But for all I know, Goldbach's conjecture might be true. For all I know, it might be false. For those who don't know, mathematicians have not been able to prove that yet. We've run through lots of examples, and it does seem true up to like a number of examples, but there's no proof of it yet. And people are like actively looking for a proof, I believe. So for all we know, it could be true, but it also could be false. It's like consistent with what we know. But like, because it's a mathematical theorem, it would just be like the Pythagorean theorem. Metaphysically speaking, it would be metaphysically necessarily true if it's true at all. And it would be metaphysically necessarily false if it's false at all. So it's like, it doesn't leave like open this kind of uncertainty that we have, because the uncertainty that we have, that's the more epistemic side of things. It might be true for all that we know, it might not be true. So in some sense, it's possibly true, but possibly false, but that's an epistemic possibility. In reality, it's metaphysically necessary either way. It's not like it could be true in one world, but false in another world. Right. So it's really, oftentimes when people hear the modal ontological argument and they hear the first premise, which we're going to get to really soon, that possibly God exists, they think, okay, fine. Like, yeah, I guess it's consistent with all that I know about the world that God could exist. Like, you know, I don't have like a proof that God doesn't exist, or, you know, so they're thinking epistemically, but right. that's not what you need for the modal ontological argument. You need to show that it's metaphysically possible.
That is, you know, and that is a very, very important distinction, because I still see even professional philosophers today, you know, conflate epistemology and ontology. And I have had so many, you know, discussions with people. Well, what does that mean? What is it? I'm like, wait a minute, we're in ontology. We're not in epistemology. You know, so I think that's a very fantastic distinction there to add the, you know, the epistemological part to it, because it is very important for people to understand that, you know, there's a time for the epistemology. There's a place for the epistemology. But when we're talking about ontology, we're not talking about things that we know and how we know it. We're talking about, you know, what underlies reality, what underlies being itself.
Yeah, what reality genuinely could have been, and not merely what is consistent with what I know about reality and like how confident I am and that sort of stuff. Like, we're talking about in extramental reality, how could things have been? Not how, like, for all I know, it might be this way or it might be that way. So Okay, so
Go ahead.
that's the three modal distinctions that I really wanted to bring out. And then before we get into the modal ontological argument, we need to briefly consider possible worlds, the definition of God, and then what an ontological argument is. So I'll be brief on these.
Good luck with that.
So possible worlds. As I use it, this is just a kind of okay. So you could talk about the semantics of possible worlds, like what do we mean by that? So by possible worlds, I use it as a mere heuristic device. So I'm not saying that there really are these existing things out there called possible worlds. I'm not committing to that. I'm just using it as a kind of semantic device, a heuristic device, to help us get a grip on what we're saying when we say that God is possible or that God is necessary. So possible would be something is possible if it exists in at least one possible world. And it's necessary if it exists or is true in all possible worlds. And correspondingly, it would be impossible if it exists in no possible worlds, and so on. So that's what I mean by possible world. But what is a possible world? Well, roughly speaking, it's just a total or complete or global or maximal way that reality as a whole could have been. So yeah, basically, like the actual world is one possible world. But presumably, had I sneezed 3 seconds ago, the world configuration would have been different. Like different truths would have been actual, and so in some sense, that would have been that could have been the actual world, but it's a different possible world, one with the same history as the actual world, but one wherein I actually sneezed at that time, and perhaps the future is really, really similar, but it's still a different possible world.
Right.
And so again, this is a heuristic device. So that's possible worlds. The second thing is, what is an ontological argument? Well, I guess. Well, okay, what is an ontological argument? Roughly, it's a kind of armchair argument. You can sit back in your armchair and you can reason from your armchair, from the principles of your own mind and your thinking and your rational thought, that God exists, purportedly, on the basis of an ontological argument. So you can think of it as an a priori proof or an a priori argument. A priori, that's just a fancy word, meaning that the justification for the premises does not rely on things of your experience. So the justification for the premises is independent of what you can experience of the world. And so that's really what we mean by a priori. And usually it's the argument, an ontological argument is based on considerations of like God's nature or God's like the definition of God, and perhaps like the nature of existence, the nature of greatness, and the nature of possibility and necessity. So that's what an ontological argument is. And finally, God. What do we mean by God? So in this context, we just mean, I guess, 3 things, pretty much. God is an ultimate reality, so he is kind of that most fundamental thing, that ultimate, that independent foundational layer of reality, this foundational being. Secondly, God is a necessary being, so God exists in all possible worlds. He cannot fail to exist. He has a robust grip on existence. And then thirdly, God is perfect. So we mean a necessarily existent, perfect, ultimate being. And what do you mean by perfect? Well, it's kind of like he's the greatest possible being. He, as Anselm famously said, he's that than which none greater can be conceived even. So he's kind of axiologically supreme or complete. He has perfect knowledge, perfect power, perfect goodness, and so on.
So
yeah.
On that note, why would it require perfection?
Do you mean the definition of God?
Yes. Why does God have to embody perfection? Because that's usually, one of the pushbacks I get on it, is, I mean, I have an answer for it, but I want to hear, how you would answer, why does God need to be perfect?
So there are kind of 2 ways that I can go responding to that. One way is to say, like, listen, what do we mean by a God? A God is something that is a being that is wholly worthy of worship. And so anything less than perfect is just not worthy of worship. Like, you wouldn't worship, I don't know, Shaquille O'Neal or something just because he's really, really good, but he's not perfect. Like, no, something has to be perfect.
I don't know. I like Shaquille O'Neal.
So something cannot fall short of perfection if it's to be worthy, truly worthy of our worship and our reverence and whatnot. So that's one way to go from worthiness of worship. And that's just constitutive of what we mean by God, just worthy of worship. A second thing that I want to say is, like, I can just stipulate this as my definition, right? Definitions, we can stipulate things. So I can just run my argument and say, listen, what I mean by God here, I'm just stipulating that it's a necessary, perfect, ultimate being. That's what I mean. Now let's talk about the argument. So those are the 2 ways.
Clarifying it for the argument. Absolutely. Yeah. And that's actually one of the angles that, I normally take. One of the ways I also answer it is, I would God would be like the exemplar of, what things are aimed at. When we talk about love, when we talk about these attributes that we normally say are positive things or good things, he would be the embodiment of what the perfect level of what those things are. So, but anyways, go ahead. I don't want to keep cutting you off.
No, that's good.
Yeah. It's just, I know there's questions like flying through people's head. And they're just,
I mean, people like, we have to do a lot of stage setting because, you can't just like throw someone into the weeds and be like, possibly, like in some possible world, there's this maximum great perfect, and it's like, and they're going to get like necessary, and they're going to think like epistemic possibility, metaphysical possibility. They're going to be like, what's an ontological argument? So like, you have to lay the groundwork, right? Philosophy is best done slowly.
Absolutely. That is so, I mean, I'm going to highlight that, and that's going to be a clip on my show, because, when I hear people say, oh, the ontological argument, oh, that's garbage. That's been answered over and over. And I'm like, just what? So I'm looking at these things and I'm like, okay, there are good objections to certain things, but it's not garbage. It's not, usually when someone says, I hear about Craig or Plantinga or these different theistic philosophers, and they're just like, oh, it's trash. His argument's trash. And I'm like, what? How could, that would be like me coming in as a theist saying that Graham Oppie's just, that's trash. Yeah. I'd never do that ever, so, but anyway, go ahead and finish up.
Yeah, no. And I should say, just, I guess, 2 further notes before we get on to the actual argument is like ontological argument. Like that's kind of misleading because, well, a lot of people think that, oh, well, ontological argument is just this one thing, but no, they're actually like tons of different versions and variations, and they're completely different arguments, really. I mean, they share this kind of common thread of being armchair a priori that I was talking about, and being based perhaps on the nature of perfection or possibility or existence or God's definition, but they're very different from one another. So you can find ontological arguments, for instance, in Spinoza, and it's different from Descartes' ontological arguments, different from, Anselm's ontological argument, different from Plantinga's, different from Malcolm's, different from this, and different from Gödel's, and so on. Like, you can go on and on. There are these different versions of the ontological argument, and papers, people should be aware of this. Papers are being published talking back and forth on ontological arguments, like every philosophical quarterly like that comes out. Like, usually there's one or more papers on ontological arguments, developing either a new one or responding to other ones or criticizing it or bringing up a new point in the debate. So these things are live discussions that are going on in philosophy. That's not to say all the arguments that have been defended in the past under ontological arguments are defended today. Like, most people think that Descartes, his ontological argument doesn't work. Most people nowadays think that you can reformulate Anselm's in an interesting way, but his first ontological argument at least doesn't work. Most philosophers today think that's true, and so on. But my point is just that for the audience, these things are actively being debated by professional philosophers on both sides, even to this day. So, don't write it off.
Yeah, and without getting into the weeds of it, I mean, modal arguments or modal logic is not just a theistic thing. It's we use, the modal logic is used for a lot of, different areas. So it's not just like this type of logic that was developed to, prove God or something like that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So like, this is developed by people like Kripke and other sorts of people way back in, I say way back.
Yeah.
It's the 20th century. It's like mid to late 20th century. Anyway, that's old. That's old for me. But bring up a point where like this modal logic is developed completely independently of philosophy of religion, and it can be and has been used across a whole host of domains. So again, like you said, it's not like people just coming up with stuff to prove God.
There are a lot of people that would push back on S5 logic.
We should probably briefly touch on that. So, the modal ontological argument that I'll just be briefly summarizing in about like 90 seconds or something, relies on this system of modal logic. The system, so a system of modal logic is essentially, it's a system of axioms that try to formalize or rigorously capture the kind of metaphysical possibility that I was talking about at the beginning. So we're trying to come up with different axioms that relate these different notions of possibility with one another, and trying to really systematize, formalize, and make rigorous our notion of metaphysical possibility. So for instance, you'll have an axiom like the distribution axiom. So if it's necessarily the case that A entails B, well then, if it's necessarily the case that A, well then it's necessarily the case that B. So like that seems just obvious. And so a lot of these axioms are going to be argued for and whatnot. But system S5 is one of the stronger versions of modal logic of the systems in question, and it incorporates the axioms that are beneath it. So that would be like S4 and other sorts of things. And the S5 axiom, which is distinctive to the X5 system, which is used in the modal ontological argument, is that whatever is possibly necessarily the case is just necessarily the case simpliciter. So I'm going to repeat that for the audience. Whatever is possibly necessarily the case is just necessarily the case simpliciter, full stop. And really, this just, you can think of modality in the range of possible worlds under S5 as kind of like a mansion. So you can think of the rooms within the mansion as different possible worlds. And according to S5, you can go from any room in the mansion to any other room. So pick any room you want. Maybe it's on the first floor, maybe it's on the 12th floor or whatever. There is a way that you can get to every other room in the mansion. And so they're like accessible from your own room. And that applies to all the different rooms in question. All of them are accessible from all the others, and so they can all access one another. And so that's really how system S5 conceives of worlds and possibility. Right. So if something is possible in one possible world, well, then it's possible in all the possible worlds. So if something is possible, well, then it's necessarily possible. And moreover, if something is necessarily the case in one world, well, that just means its necessity bleeds out to all the other worlds. Because if you go to that world, that means that that thing is necessary in that world because it's possibly necessary. And if it's necessary in that world, well, then from the perspective of that world, that thing holds in all possible worlds. But remember, all possible worlds in the mansion analogy, that's going to be all the rooms, including your own room. So then it's going to be necessarily true in all the worlds, including the actual world. So you can think of the system S5 and how it captures or articulates metaphysical possibility in terms of that mansion. And so if something's possible, it's going to be necessarily possible. That's like if there's a room in the mansion, well, then it can be reached by all the rooms in the mansion. And then if it's possibly necessary, well, then it's just necessary simpliciter. So if it could be the case that it holds in all, something holds in all the rooms, well, then it's actually the case that it holds in all the rooms. So that is enough by way of preliminaries. And now we can get on to the argument.
Yeah, now we go over the argument.
Yes. I should say, well, one final thing. I should say that not all philosophers are on board with S5.
Right.
But a large number are. And it's defended completely independently of the modal ontological argument. And it's respectable. It's developed by analytic philosophers completely prior to any reflections on the modal ontological argument. It's respectable. It's defended by metaphysicians. A lot of people think it accurately captures metaphysical modality, but there is controversy there.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's Rasmussen's contingency argument is reliant on S5 logic. Yes. So he gives a brief defense of S5 logic on that one too. So all right, so for everybody that's following, we've defined God. He's explained what modal logic is, how we deal with modality,
different kinds of possibility,
right? Different types of possibilities. This is it's part of the S5 logic system is what this particular argument is utilizing, which is controversial in academia, so and on that, now he will present his awesome knockdown argument.
Okay, so this is just a simplified version of it, and like I said, I didn't come up with this. I'm just conveying it from Alvin Plantinga, and this is really simplified. This is the best way to present it, I think. So it's just one premise, and then you get the conclusion. So here's the one premise: possibly God exists. Conclusion 2, therefore God exists. So how does that follow? Okay, remember S5. S5 says that if something's possibly necessary, well, then it's necessary. So, and remember our definition of God. This is why we laid those foundations earlier. Remember our definition of God. God is a necessary being. So by saying that possibly God exists, we're saying that possibly There's this necessarily existent, perfect, ultimate being. But that means that it's possibly necessarily the case that there is such a being. But by S5, whatever is possibly necessary is just necessary simpliciter. Yeah. So it's just necessary that this being exists. And if it's necessary that this being exists, well, then obviously it actually exists. Wow. So you can deduce using S5 and the definition of God that I was talking about earlier from the mere possibility, and remember, this is metaphysical possibility. We're not talking about epistemic possibility. We're talking about metaphysical possibility. If it's metaphysically possible that God exists, it simply follows that God exists. And so the first premise says, yes, it is indeed true that God possibly exists. And so conclusion, God exists. So that's the argument. So we're done. Goodbye, everyone. No, I'm kidding.
Hey, he solved it. Everything's done. There's no sense even being here and discussing it. So what objections do you have to it?
Ooh, okay. So I kind of want to give the lay of the land before giving my own objections. So one kind of objection that people give is just an objection based on incoherence arguments. So they say, well, no, you gave me this notion of God with like perfect knowledge, perfect power. He's perfectly free. He's perfectly rational. He's necessarily existent. That actually isn't possible because it's incoherent. There's some kind of internal incoherency there. So this is, perhaps we can call it the incoherence response. There's also, you can give a response along the lines of a tension response. So you could say, okay, maybe it's not incoherent, but it seems to be in tension with, let's say, for example, lots of seemingly gratuitous or pointless sufferings in the world, like a fawn dying in the forest fire. And if it seems in tension with that, well then, we can say, if it's intention there, well then based on that evidence, we can think that it's probably not actual. And if it's probably not actual, well then it's possibly false. You can say that if it's not actual, well then it's clearly possibly not the case because whatever's actual is possible. And if it's possibly not the case, well then just by S5, you can run the argument in reverse and get that if it's possibly not the case that God exists, well then it's necessarily not the case. Because again, God is a necessary being. So under S5, he's either existing in all possible worlds or in no possible worlds. There's no in between. And so that's an incoherence argument response or a tension argument response. We're just going to focus on the incoherence one. So what might people say on behalf of this? Well, they might say, oh, well, look, God is supposed to be free, but if he's morally perfect, he can't sin. And so he can't do this thing. He's not free to sin. And so what do you mean he's free? I mean, he's supposed to be morally perfect. So that, they might say that there's some kind of incoherence there. I'm not defending these things. I'm just articulating them. So that's one. Maybe another one they might say, well, listen, God's supposed to be infallibly omniscient. But then, he already knows what actions he's going to perform. And so how could then he be free to, refrain from performing them? It would seem as though he would have, if he had the ability to do otherwise, well, then he would have had the ability to, either make him mistaken in his prior belief, say, or make it be such the case that his prior belief was false. But, intuitively, people think that the past is fixed. You can't, alter the past. Right. There's no use crying over spilled milk. So, and right. There are different ways you can formalize this, but this kind of incoherence argument says that you can't have both a free being that acts freely and an infallibly omniscient being, because infallible omniscience is going to preclude that kind of freedom. And again, I'm not defending these arguments. Right. And then I guess the final, I'm just gesturing towards incoherence arguments. The final incoherence argument that I want to pinpoint is you could say, if God is ultimate, God's supposed to be the ground of everything distinct from him. He's supposed to be that's just what we mean by ultimacy. God is ultimate. He's supposed to be the explanation of all other things apart from himself. But God presumably has distinct properties like omnipotence and omniscience and whatnot. So then that would seem to mean that, and these are essential to God. So that would seem to mean that if God is the ground of everything distinct from God, it would seem that God would have to be the ground of his own essential properties. But so the argument goes, nothing could be the ground of its own essential properties, because in order for something to ground another thing, it would already, as it were, have to exist, and hence have the features that are essential for its existence, right? Grounding is a kind of priority relation. And right. So if X grounds Y, well then X's existence is in some sense prior to Y. But in that case, whatever is essential for X's existence is also prior to Y. So then we get the absurdity that God's essential features are prior to God's essential features, which is absurd if God grounds God's properties. Now, I'll just leave it there. Those are incoherence type arguments.
But couldn't you escape that with the divine simplicity?
then they're going to go on to say that itself is incoherent. so yeah, you are correct that's one way that you could.
They would go to some type of modal collapse, or
you could. Well, yeah, you could run a bunch of different arguments there, but that you are right that argument assumed that divine simplicity is false. But then they would just say either divine simplicity is true or it's false. If it's true, you get this worry that God's supposed to be grounding God's essential properties, and then they're going to argue that might not be the case. Now, I'm skeptical that succeeds, but we can set that aside. And then you could say, okay, if it's true, then you get this absurdity. But if if divine simplicity is false, you get this absurdity that God would have to ground God's parts. Excuse me. And then if it's true, well, then you get the absurdities that are attendant with divine simplicity. So the argument would go. And so either way, whether God's simple or not, you get this incoherence. And so you get the incoherence type argument running. Again, for the audience, I'm not defending these arguments. I can hear people like just screaming at me, and they're like, Joe is like, no, I'm not defending these arguments here. I'm just articulating them. Yeah, I'm giving you a sense of the incoherence arguments that people level as a response to the first premise of the modal ontological argument. Right. So don't crucify me, people.
So how would we get from the metaphysical necessity or possibility to the epistemic? How do we bridge epistemology with the necessity of God metaphysically?
That is such a great question. That kind of asks, how do we know that first premise is true? Like, sure, it might be the case, for all I know, God might exist, but how do we go from there to the actual metaphysical claim that God possibly exists? Like, after all, I gave that argument and I never justified that first premise. I never gave any reasons for it. So here are some that try to bridge that gap. One thing you might think is like, conceivability is, you might say, is at least somewhat of a reliable guide to possibility claims. So if I can conceive of something, that gives me reason for thinking that it's metaphysically possible. So for instance, just think about normal cases. Like, I think that I could have, as a metaphysical possibility, I could have failed to exist because my parents could never have met. Well, why do I think that? It's not because it's actually the case. That's certainly not the reason why I think that. Well, what is the reason? It's like, it didn't actually happen. So like, how am I supposed to know this? Well, some philosophers think that we're justified in thinking that precisely because I can like coherently think and conceive of a situation in which my parents never met. Like maybe my father just wasn't into brunettes, or like, I don't know, like we're getting a little weird now, but I can easily conceive and flesh out a coherent situation in my mind. And that is going to be giving me, so these philosophers argue, some weight of a reason to think that such a situation would indeed be metaphysically possible because it's conceivable. I can kind of work out the details in my mind. I'm coherent with that. There seems to be nothing wrong or incoherent about that kind of worked out situation. And so the fact that we can conceive it like that, we can work out the scenario, we don't see any inconsistencies that crop up, we can like fully flesh it out, that's going to give us some weight of a reason to think that it's metaphysically possible. So that's one way that you could do it. There are other ways as well. They get really complicated because we're talking about modal epistemology here. Right. And so modal epistemology is really kind of how you bridge that gap from the actual world and what we know about it to our justified beliefs about metaphysical necessity and possibility. So that's one way. Yeah. I hope that goes a little bit to show you.
Yeah, you said justified. My brain's like going all over the place now. So
yeah,
that's every time I hear, when I talk with people who aren't, familiar with, epistemology, and they say, well, how do you justify that? And I'm like, well, how much time do you have? How familiar are you with justifications?
Yeah.
So So what is it about the ontological argument or ontological arguments that kind of piques your interest? Is it just ontology in general, or
what piques my interest is this objection? And it's a good objection, and the ways that people have tried to avoid the objection are fascinating to me. So let's get that objection on the table. So far I've just looked at the kind of incoherence objection, as well as the kind of tension objection of the problem of evil one and so on. But here's the biggest objection, really, and this isn't like new to me or anything. Like, philosophers know about this. The objection is just a symmetrical argument. Listen, the first the argument that I gave said, one, possibly God exists, therefore God exists. Well, here's a symmetrical argument. Possibly God doesn't exist, therefore God doesn't exist. That also follows by S5 logic. Like the conclusion does follow from that first premise by S5, because God's a necessary being, and so by S5 he either exists in all the worlds or none of the worlds.
Right.
There's no in between. And so if it's at least possible that he exists in one world, he's going to exist in all. But if it's also possible that he exists, if it's possible that he doesn't exist in one world, well, then he's not going to exist in any. So because you got this total bifurcation, he's either in all of them or in none of them. And so if you can find at least one that he isn't in, it simply follows. Yeah, it simply follows that he's not in any. And so that just seems like a perfectly symmetrical premise. And by symmetry here, I just mean like it seems on epistemic par with the other one. Like we have just as much a reason to accept one as the other, just independent of other considerations. Like if I say, possibly X, and you say, well, possibly not X, like there's a symmetry there. We don't have any principled, non-arbitrary, non-question begging reason to favor one over the other or at the expense of the other. It would just be like, it'd be like foot stomping or something. You're privileging one at the expense of the other for no principled reason. And so they seem symmetrical. They seem on par, and yet they deliver the incompatible result. And so what this objection says, the arguments are a wash. Like the original argument doesn't give you any reason to believe in God because you have this symmetrical argument that totally cancels it out. And so we're right back where we started with no successful argument for God's existence. So that's the objection. And
so that would be the reverse ontological.
Yeah, that's a reverse ontological argument. Now, what do you do in the literature now? Now you start to look for what's called a symmetry breaker. A symmetry breaker tries to, do what it sounds like. It breaks that symmetry between the possibility premise of the original argument that possibly God exists and the possibility premise of the reverse argument that possibly God doesn't exist. So you're looking for a symmetry breaker, something that favors one possibility premise at the expense of the other. So some consideration that gives us reason to think that possibly God does exist, which doesn't also support the reverse claim that possibly God doesn't exist. So that's called a symmetry breaker. And that's where the literature has focused on and it kind of exploded. And it's that, and like you were asking me that question, what makes me interested in this? That's what makes me interested in it. I love talking about and thinking about symmetry breakers, and I just think it gets us into so many fun questions about epistemology and ontology, and it like brings together so many different considerations from so many different fields that I just love thinking about the symmetry breakers. So
yeah, I'm with you on there. My unfortunately, a lot of my theology lacks because I spend so much time with, epistemology and ontology and formal logic and things like that. I just, I'm a structure-minded kind of person. So, when you can combine math, with reality, words, phrases. I've actually been doing a lot of studying lately in semantics and pragmatics, because so many, which is what I love about every video that I've watched of yours where you have talked about an argument or something like that. You're very careful to put the underlying information there. What your definitions are clearly, concisely. This is the paradigm we're working from. This is because I hear people say, "Oh, we're just arguing semantics." Well, that's the crux of the matter. The semantics is what's important. The pragmatics of it, for those who aren't familiar with the semantics is the meaning of what someone says. So you have the syntax is when is the order in how it's put together. Is it properly put together? And then you have semantics of what does that order mean, based on, and then the pragmatics is what does the person talking about it mean? So and a lot of times we're just arguing semantics. No, that's where we're at, because, and I'm guilty of it myself. I've been in a couple of debates and, lined out definitions of what I was talking about, but I didn't go through the structure of what I was talking about and how I was applying it and the paradigm and things. So I think that is extremely, important when we have these discussions.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just imagining if I just went at the start and I just said, there's some possible world in which God exists, therefore God exists. Boom. And like everyone would be like, what's a possible world? What is possibility? What do you mean by God? Like you need to get that stuff down at the beginning, and you need to lay the framework, because that's so essential. That's how you do philosophy, and it needs to be done slowly.
And that's where we, falter a lot in general conversations, philosophers or not, is we don't ask, what do you mean by that? We don't ask things like that. We take our understanding
we just
and
assume.
we apply it, so then you end up with stuff like, oh, ontological arguments are terrible, and it's just like, I just, when I, hear stuff like that. Now, I'm not, unless you are really into metaphysics, and modal logic and things of that nature, it isn't convincing at all. It's and I wouldn't even say it's real convincing at that level, but there's a lot more discussion with it, like you were talking about. This isn't something that's just blown over. It's very important in philosophy. It's something that's hashed out all the time, and people are still working with it and interacting with it, so yeah, at the lay level, they're just like, oh, it's just, what about the perfect island? You're just like, and it just, and I'm a dummy because I get involved with it and I try to explain concepts that aren't easily explainable in a short amount of time. So, but yeah, man, I appreciate the way that you laid it all out, working with the paradigms that we're working with, the objections to it, because I'm kind of like you with the, how do we deal with the reverse ontological argument? It on the face of it, it seems, to be pretty rock solid objection. I have my own opinions about it. But they're probably less informed than yours, so I'm more interested in yours. So, given the symmetry, is this something that you've written on, or?
Well, yes and no. So yes and no. So like right now I have one paper under review on one particular symmetry breaker, and over the summer, sort of over the summer, sort of right now, I'm working on a paper on one of Josh Rasmussen's symmetry breakers. I love Josh, like with all my heart, but I'm going to be criticizing one of his symmetry breakers. It's a new symmetry breaker that he gives, and I'm going to be criticizing it because I do not think it succeeds. And I'm thinking also about writing a paper on one of Proust's symmetry breakers as well, and I've already got the outline of that one. So yes and no, in the sense that I haven't published on it yet. I've published on classical theism a lot so far, and other arguments for God's existence. But this one, hopefully, fingers crossed, in the coming months, I'll have some publications on it, because I have at least one under review on it. So,
all right, oh, rock on. That's sweet. Yeah, that's you got to criticize Josh. I mean, that's just he's too nice. He's too sweet.
Hey, criticism is the love language for philosophers. So
that's right. Absolutely, it means you care about them. You know. So in the chat we have Spartan Theology, and he actually had Josh on his show talking about universalism, and it's he's one of those guys, man. It just you can't not like him.
I know,
because he is brilliant, but he's also very humble.
Yes,
he's very. It's like Oppie, I mean, if you don't like Graham Oppie, something's wrong with you.
Yeah, well, people don't know, but he's like such a gentleman. Like, he will help you so much if you just like politely ask. He's such a helper. It's unbelievable.
And not only that, as brilliant as he is, when I watched the exchange between him and Loke, and Loke went through, this massive amount of premises, and then Graham responds with, so we have these arguments, and every time we have these arguments, then you justify your premises, and I'm not going to accept your premises. And basically, in a nutshell, in the kindest way possible, he says, let's cut through the BS. Where is our disagreement? Let's deal with that, And I was just like cheering him on. I mean, I like Loke. I really do like Loke too. But I was kind of like, yeah, there you go. Let's get to the heart of the matter. But yeah, that was a fun exchange. So, so I usually try to keep it around, about an hour. I'm ADHD, so I assume everybody else is. And So, is there anything else that you wanted to add to it, or any objections you wanted to?
Well, no, I mean, I want people to know that, there's a big literature here, and there are lots of different symmetry breakers, and you can actually propose them for either argument. Most of it's been focused on, most of the literature has been focused on symmetry breaking in favor of the original argument. I think it's still an open question. For the state of the literature, I think it's still an open question as to whether or not any of them succeed. And you'll find philosophers defending both sides. And so this is something that if people are interested in, they can look into it. And one place to start that's a really good introduction just came out. It's cheap. It's by Cambridge. It's by Cambridge Elements series. It's Tyron Goldschmidt's book on ontological arguments. It's really short. The Cambridge Elements series is kind of like a summary series. The books are usually really, really short. They're 60 pages to 60 to 70 to 80 pages usually. And it gives a tremendous summary of ontological arguments from the history to today. It talks about the modal ontological argument and different potential symmetry breakers. That's the best place to start for people who want to dig into this further. But yeah, always question, always keep thinking, always keep learning, and always appreciate the majesty of reason. So.
Absolutely. That's I love one of my go-to or used to be go-tos was I don't know if you're familiar with Carneades.org on
yeah. Stay skeptical, everybody.
That's right. It was because I am, even though I'm a theist, I'm skeptical by nature. I'm like I was talking about, with certainty and how much as far as justification and what I believe and the confidence in that. I think there's a healthy dose of skepticism. I think sometimes people are overly skeptic, and if I'm sure you're familiar with Liz Jackson's work, where she talks about the global skeptic versus the local skeptic. If you're going to be a skeptic, you better be a global skeptic because, local skepticism it's a lot harder to try to defend. So I'm gonna give you a chance, Joe. I really appreciate you hanging out with us and sharing this argument. It's not too often that I can bring someone on to actually talk about, ontology or ontological arguments or stuff, because so many people are bored with it. But I'm like you, man. I'm fascinated by it, So I've said many a times, bless Ben Arbor's heart, man. But he was working on some ontology stuff. It's such a tragedy there. But I was such a fan, man. He was so good at breaking it down for people like me, and man, we're definitely going to miss out on his work. But man, I appreciate it, Joe. Thank you so much for coming on. I'm gonna give you a chance to plug your stuff. So it's all on you now. I'm gonna put the spotlight on you.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me on. I really enjoyed this, and yeah, I just find this stuff boundlessly fascinating. Talking about ontology, epistemology, all this sort of stuff, and how it relates to philosophy of religion. I guess just where you guys can find me. You can find me at Majesty of Reason. That's my YouTube channel. I also have a blog by that name, and I have a book by that name as well. It's on Amazon. You can find it if you're curious. That's on critical thinking in the context of philosophy. And yeah, I guess that's pretty much all. I mean, I also have a Phil Papers site if you guys want to check out some of the papers that I've written and whatnot. But other than that, the main thing is my YouTube channel, Majesty of Reason. So, but again, thank you for this.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Definitely would like to have you back. Maybe, maybe a longer show and do, some real deep dives and technicalities and things of that nature. So
you gotta love the technicalities.
Thank you, bud. I appreciate it.
Thanks.
So that is this episode. Joe Schmid. He's an author. He's a philosopher. He's a superstar on the up and come up. Yeah, he's young. Don't hold it against him. But his book, I actually downloaded it from Amazon, and it is not actually as if I expected something different, but it's a really good book, and I do highly recommend it. So I've got a few people coming up. I'm going to start doing a lot more shows. I'm probably going to do about 2 a week now. I wanted to give an update on my daughter and the situations there. So I did the show or the little brief update on everything about, stepping back and, kind of spending a little more time, with the family and things of that. So my daughter's responding well to treatment. She has, days that she really doesn't feel good, but it seems like we're on the right path. We've had a couple more wrenches thrown in there. I was actually just recently diagnosed with rheumatoid arthritis on top of my wife being sick with autoimmune disorder and my daughter being sick with autoimmune disorder. I'm less concerned about me and more concerned about them. So that's where we're at now. But I'm a positive guy. I won't be defined by the difficulties that we have. I won't let them defeat us. It's only going to bring us together stronger, and we're going to, fight as a family. We'll be together. We'll spend the time together that we need to spend, and raise the awareness that we need to raise for it. So I appreciate everybody tuning in. I will be doing an update probably in a day or so about upcoming guests as soon as I have some days that are confirmed. Don't forget, you can catch Brute Facts on all the major podcast platforms. Sometimes it takes me a couple of days to get them uploaded, but it's on Apple Podcasts, it's on Google Podcasts, Spotify, all of them. And I want to thank Joe again for coming on and spending the time with us and talking about these deep philosophical things, ones that I happily enjoy talking about. And if you're in the audience and got lost a little bit, sorry, but we got to do these time to time because, this is kind of the crowd that we hang around, and, iron sharpens iron. So with that, everybody have a good rest of the week, and I will give updates on upcoming shows, hopefully pretty soon. As soon as I find my exit video. Don't know where it went. Okay.
Welcome to the Brute Facts Podcast with your host and everybody's favorite Christian, Eddie Kroom. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel and hit that notification bell